The dog wasn't supposed to survive the night. That was what the vet in Petawawa had said, quietly, so the man standing in the doorway wouldn't have to hear it straight on. "We'll do what we can." Which, in the language of people who have delivered too much bad news, meant, don't get attached. Gideon Marsh had spent 22 years learning not to get attached. It was the first thing they teach you, in a way that isn't teaching at all. Just repetition. Just miles of cold water and mud and sleep deprivation until the part of you that hesitates gets worn down to nothing. He'd been good at it. Exceptional, even. His commanding officer used to say Gideon could walk through a hurricane and come out the other side with dry socks and no opinion about it. That was before Trout Lake. He drove back to the property that night with the heat on full and the radio off. The gravel road to the cabin was 2 kilometers of ruts and spruce shadow, and the headlights barely reached far enough ahead to matter. He'd bought the place 4 years ago with the kind of money that had nowhere else to go, and he'd spent the time since making it livable in the way a man makes things livable when he doesn't particularly care how they turn out. The porch was solid. The roof didn't leak. The stove worked, that was enough. Inside, he put the kettle on and stood at the window, looking out at nothing. The vet had found the puppy in the drainage ditch off Highway 17, wedged under a piece of culvert pipe, hypothermic and half-starved, with a broken back leg and both eyes swollen nearly shut. Someone had left it there. Not accidentally. The leg had been broken the way legs get broken when someone decides to break them. And the vet, a young woman named Patricia, who had clearly been crying before Gideon arrived, had used words like deliberate and intentional in a flat, careful voice that said she'd made a decision to be clinical about it and was holding that decision with both hands. Gideon had only stopped because his truck was the first one on the road when Patricia's colleague called the emergency line. He was the closest warm body with a vehicle. It wasn't sentiment. It was proximity. He told himself that again now, standing at the window with his tea going cold. He'd been living at Trout Lake for 4 years, and he hadn't named the property, or put up a mailbox or bought a second mug. His daughter called every Sunday from Vancouver, and he let most of those calls go to voicemail, and then he called back on Tuesdays when he knew she'd be at work, so he could leave a message saying he was fine. Which he was, mostly. In the way that a thing can be structurally sound and still have water getting in somewhere you can't find. His wife, Carol, had died in the spring 3 years ago. She'd been sick before he retired, sick while he was finishing his last tour, sick in the way that a person is sick when the thing making them sick is very old and very serious and very patient. He'd made it home in time, which people kept telling him was a blessing. He understood what they meant. He didn't disagree. He just found that blessings, in his experience, didn't make the mornings shorter or the cabin less quiet. He went to bed at 9 and didn't sleep well. Patricia called at 7 in the morning. Her voice had lost the clinical flatness. He made it through the night. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Outside, the lake was gray and still, and a single loon was calling from somewhere past the tree line. "You there?" Patricia said. "I'm here. I wasn't expecting it, honestly." "He's tough." "Good," Gideon said. There was a pause. "He's going to need somewhere to go. Once he's stable. We're a small practice. We don't have long-term boarding facilities." Gideon understood what she wasn't saying. He'd been understanding what people weren't saying his whole life. It was a skill that had served him well in places where people not saying things directly was the difference between coming home and not. "I'll come by," he said. He didn't know why he said it. He thought about it all the way into town. The dog was in a cage in the back room, small and battered, and wrapped in a fleece blanket that had small yellow ducks on it. His leg was splinted. His eyes were less swollen than the night before. When Gideon crouched down in front of the cage, the dog looked at him with a kind of direct, uncomplicated attention that Gideon hadn't encountered in a long time. Most things looked at Gideon sideways. His daughter. The men at the Legion in Pembroke who'd known him before. Even the spruce trees around the cabin seemed to lean away slightly, as if they could feel the weight of whatever he was carrying and had decided to give it some room. This dog looked at him straight on. "He'll need a name," Patricia said from the doorway. "He's not mine." "No," she agreed in a tone that said something different. Gideon looked at the dog for a long time. The dog looked back. "Corporal," Gideon said finally. Patricia blinked. Sorry? That's what I'll call him, if he ends up at my place. Which I haven't decided. Of course, Patricia said. She was trying not to smile. He noticed. He took the dog home on a Thursday 6 days after finding him in the ditch, in a plastic crate borrowed from Patricia's clinic with a dish of water wedged in one corner and the duck blanket folded underneath. He drove slowly on the ruts. He didn't explain this to himself. The first thing Corporal did when Gideon set the crate down on the porch was make a sound. It wasn't a bark. It was something between a bark and a word, a long, complicated vocalization that went up at the end like a question. Gideon stared at him. Corporal stared back, and then did it again, shorter this time, more declarative. I don't know what that means, Gideon said. Corporal did it a third time. I'm not having this conversation, Gideon said, and went inside to make some coffee. Through the window, he could see the crate on the porch. He could see Corporal sitting up in it, looking at the tree line, and then looking back at the window, and then at the tree line again, with the focused proprietary air of someone conducting an inspection of new premises and finding them acceptable. Gideon drank his coffee. Then he went back outside, unlatched the crate, and sat down on the porch step. Corporal made his way out slowly, favoring the splinted leg, and placed himself next to Gideon's boot. Not on his lap, not asking for anything. Just there, present. Two living things sitting on a porch in the Shield country morning, listening to the spruce trees and the wind off the lake. Gideon hadn't sat on the porch in 4 years. The thing about Corporal was that he didn't stop talking. That was the only word for it. Talking, not barking. Gideon had been around enough dogs, military and otherwise, to know the difference. Barking was alarm, or demand, or the mechanical expression of a dog's instinct to fill silence. What Corporal did was something else. It had range. It had timing. He would come to find Gideon in the woodshed and say something in the low, rolling register that Gideon had started, privately, to think of as reportorial. As if Corporal were briefing him on conditions outside. He would stand at the kitchen door in the evening and say something brief and pointed that was clearly about supper. He would sit at the end of the dock and speak to the lake in long, wandering sentences that didn't seem to require any particular response, just the presence of someone to hear them. Gideon had spent 4 years in a cabin with nothing but his own thoughts for company, and he had never once said anything to the lake. He started talking back, at first just to fill the silence on Corporal's end, when the dog seemed to be waiting for a reply. Yeah, I see it. When Corporal alerted at a hawk circling the ridge. You're right, it's cold. When Corporal gave him a long look at the door in November, and then looked pointedly at the woodpile. I don't know what you want me to do about the ice. When Corporal stood at the lake's edge and delivered what appeared to be a statement of significant concern about the freeze-up, he noticed, one evening in late November, that he'd spoken more words that day than in any single day since Carol died. He noticed it and didn't quite know what to do with the noticing. His daughter, Nadia, came up from Vancouver at Christmas. She was 34 or 35. He had to think about it, which embarrassed him, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's way of being quiet when she was evaluating a situation. She came alone. The man she'd been seeing, a landscape architect named something Gideon could never remember, had apparently not survived the fall. She pulled up in a rental and stood in the driveway looking at the cabin, and then at the porch where Corporal was sitting very straight with his ears forward, watching her with serious professional attention. You got a dog, she said. He got me, Gideon said. There's a distinction. Nadia crouched down in the driveway. Corporal regarded her for a moment with the particular gravity he brought to all first assessments, and then he said something. One of his short, conclusive sounds, the kind Gideon had come to think of as affirmative, and went to her. He talks, Nadia said, laughing, rubbing Corporal behind the ears. Constantly, Gideon said. I don't know where he gets it. She looked up at him. He wasn't expecting the expression on her face. It was something he hadn't seen directed at him in a long time, something warm and a little careful, like a door being opened on a room that's been dark for a while, and there's not yet any certainty about what the light will find. You look okay, Dad, she said. I am okay, he said, and for the first time in a long time, he said it without checking it against the internal evidence first. He just said it. Christmas was 3 days. Nadia slept in the room he'd set up after Carol died, with the extra quilt from the cedar chest and the small lamp on the nightstand that Carol had bought at a market in Prince Edward County the summer before she was diagnosed. Gideon had kept the lamp plugged in. He hadn't thought about why until he saw Nadia turn it on and stand there for a moment, and he understood that he'd kept it plugged in because some part of him wanted there to be light in that room. Corporal divided himself between them with the impartiality of a professional, sleeping at the foot of Nadia's bed at night and appearing at Gideon's knee in the mornings with his briefing on overnight conditions. On the second day, Nadia was sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee when Corporal came in from the porch and gave a long, involved report that seemed to cover several topics. She listened to the whole thing seriously, nodding at intervals, and then looked at Gideon. What was that one about? Squirrel situation. He's been monitoring it. Is it bad? He has concerns, Gideon said. He's brought them to my attention several times. Nadia laughed, really laughed, the way she'd laughed as a kid, not the careful, managed laugh she'd been using with him for the last 3 years. And something shifted in the kitchen, in the light off the snow through the window, in the particular quality of the silence around them. Something eased. Later, after supper, she said, I used to worry about you here. I know, I'm not saying I don't anymore. I'm just saying it's different now. Because of the dog. Because of you, she said. The dog just made it visible. He thought about that for a long time after she went to bed. He sat at the window where he used to stand and look out at nothing. But Corporal had arranged himself across Gideon's feet, warm and solid and quietly vocal even in sleep. Small sounds, dream sounds, the running commentary of a dog who had things to say even when unconscious, and the nothing outside had the lake in it, and the stars that had come out after the clouds cleared, and the tree line that he knew now like the back of his own hand, and it didn't feel like nothing anymore. It hadn't felt like nothing for a while. He just hadn't noticed when that changed. There was a man named Everett who lived 12 kilometers down the road, in a house his parents had left him that he was slowly and not very successfully restoring. He'd been a constable with the OPP for 18 years, and then something had happened on a call in Renfrew that he didn't talk about, and now he wasn't, and now he was doing what he could with the house and with himself, which most days meant he was doing all right with the house. Gideon had known him slightly, the way you know people in the Shield country when they're close enough to nod at and far enough to leave alone. He ran into Everett at the hardware store in Petawawa in January, buying weather stripping, and they stood in the aisle for a moment with the particular awkwardness of 2 men who both understood what the other one was carrying and had made a mutual, unspoken agreement not to bring it up. Corporal was in the truck. He had opinions about being left in the truck, which he had expressed clearly on the way in and was presumably continuing to express to the parking lot. Heard you had a dog, Everett said. Word travels. Patricia mentioned it. We play cards sometimes. She said he was the one from the highway. He was. Everett was quiet for a moment, turning a packet of weather stripping over in his hands. He had the look of someone who was working up to something and wasn't sure if there was enough runway. I had a dog, he said. Retired service dog. Shepherd. Lost her in October. I'm sorry, Gideon said. 13 years, Everett said. She was there for everything. He put the weather stripping back on the shelf and picked it up again. I keep thinking I should get another one. Then I think it's too soon. Then I don't know what too soon means for a dog. Then I think about it again. Gideon understood all of that precisely. He'd had that same conversation with himself about people, about whether it was too soon to let anyone in after Carol, about what too soon meant when the person you'd lost had been the architecture of your daily life for 31 years. Come for coffee, he said. Saturday. Corporal can give you his assessment. His assessment, he has opinions about people. They're usually accurate. Everett considered this. Then, for the first time since Gideon had met him, he smiled. Just slightly, just enough. All right, he said. Saturday. Everett came Saturday and sat on the porch with his coffee going cold in his hands, looking at the lake with the expression of someone who hadn't been somewhere simply pleasant in a long time and wasn't quite sure how to inhabit it. Corporal sat in front of him for a long, assessing moment, and then delivered a full briefing. Thorough, unhurried, several distinct topics covered, and then placed his head on Everett's knee. Everett put his hand on Corporal's head and didn't say anything. Gideon drank his coffee and looked at the tree line and let the silence do what it needed to do. After a while, Everett said, "Does he always do that? Talk to people?" "The other part, the staying, yeah," Gideon said. "He's got a sense for it." Everett nodded slowly. His hand was still on Corporal's head. Corporal hadn't moved. The lake was flat and silver in the January light, and somewhere in the spruce a whiskey jack was working through something in sharp, decisive beats. "I haven't sat somewhere like this in a long time," Everett said. "Neither had I," Gideon said, before him. They sat there until the coffee was long cold, and then Gideon got up and made more, and they sat there some more. And Corporal made his periodic reports to the lake and to the tree line, and to the specific quality of the sky over the ridge, and neither man told him to stop. Spring came the way it comes in the Ottawa Valley, fast and muddy and smelling of ice melt and spruce, and something older beneath both of those. The road turned to soup in March. The lake ice went out on a Wednesday afternoon while Gideon was splitting wood, and he heard it, the long, tectonic groan and then the silence after, and set down the axe and listened. Corporal came around the corner of the shed at a careful three-legged trot, the fourth leg having recovered enough over the winter to use but not yet trusted completely for speed. He sat next to Gideon and made a sound Gideon had come to recognize as the one reserved for significant events. Long, low, 2 distinct syllables. "Yeah," Gideon said. "I heard it too." They went down to the dock together. The ice was in the middle of the lake now, moving slowly toward the south end, and the open water was that particular blue it only is for the first few days after thaw, a blue that looks like something that just remembered it was alive. Gideon had seen that color before, on the lake, in other years. He had not noticed it in a long time. He stood there and noticed it. Everett got a dog in April. He came to tell Gideon about it in person, driving up the now dry gravel road, with a 6-month-old mixed breed in the back seat, who was not talking the way Corporal talked, but was clearly making attempts. Everett stood in the driveway grinning with the particular grin of a person who has done something they weren't sure they were ready for and found out they were ready. The two dogs conducted their introductions with the formality the occasion required, and then chased each other around the woodshed in a wide, joyful loop. Corporal was still favoring the bad leg slightly, so he ran in a way that compensated, asymmetrical and absolutely committed. "What's his name?" Gideon asked. "Hardy," Everett said. "After? It doesn't matter. It's just a name that felt right." Gideon nodded. He understood names that felt right. He understood things that didn't need explaining, that just settled into place like a word you'd been looking for. "Coffee," he said. "Yeah," Everett said. "Coffee." They sat on the porch while the dogs ran, and the lake was blue-green and full of the sounds of May, and somewhere behind the property a pair of loons were working out their seasonal arrangements with the lake. Corporal came back eventually and sat on the step below Gideon's feet and made his report on the new dog. Comprehensive measured with what sounded very much like a positive conclusion, and Gideon said good to know and meant it. Nadia called on a Sunday in May, and this time he picked up on the second ring. "You're there," she said, and he could hear the small adjustment in her voice, the pleasure of it. "I'm here," he said. They talked for 40 minutes, which was more than they'd talked in any phone call since Carol's funeral. She told him about a project she was working on, something to do with housing in East Van. And he listened and asked questions that meant he'd actually been listening. And she told him about a farmer's market she'd started going to. And he told her about the ice going out, and the loons and the dogs running around the woodshed, and at some point Corporal came into the kitchen and made a brief, courteous interjection, and Nadia laughed and said, "Tell him I said hi," and Gideon looked down at Corporal and said, "She says hi," and Corporal made the sound that meant acknowledged and noted. "I want to come up in June," Nadia said, "for longer, maybe 2 weeks." "The road's good in June," he said. "Bring whatever you need." Yeah, he said. "There's room." There was room. He'd been in that cabin for 4 years, telling himself it was enough space for one person and one set of grief, and somewhere between the ditch on Highway 17 and the ice. Going out in the Saturday mornings on the porch, with 2 men who didn't need to explain themselves to each other, He'd discovered it was actually a larger place than he'd given it credit for. That it could hold more than he'd tried to put in it. That had not been his plan. He didn't have a plan, still. He woke up in the morning and split wood, or drove into town, or sat on the dock watching the lake, and Corporal sat with him, or ran the property, or delivered his reports with the reliable authority of someone with a professional obligation to keep people informed, and the days had stopped feeling like something to get through and started feeling like something to be inside of. That was the difference. That was all it was, really. One morning, you're standing at a window looking at nothing, and then something changes. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, and you're just standing there looking at the lake. And the lake looks back, and somewhere on the step behind you, a small, battered, undefeated dog is telling you, in his own elaborate and completely sincere language, that the morning is good, and the squirrel situation bears watching, and everything out there, as far as he can see, is exactly as it should be.